Hi, this is Geoff Garrett. It's the 1st of April 2020, and today I'm with Jim Cowles. Jim is a Wharton MBA graduate from 1979. He's about to join our graduate executive board, and he's a proud Wharton parent. On the corporate side, Jim was a longtime senior executive at Citi, including a long stint as CEO of the EMEA region. And now post-Citibank, he's really involved with a bunch of FinTech startups in the UK. So, Jim, thanks for being with us today.
Geoff, I wish it were different circumstances, but it's certainly a pleasure to be with you. Thank you.
So here we have, I think, three big topics. I'd love to get your read on what's happening in the UK. The UK came to the crisis a little bit late. Boris Johnson was criticised for being a little bit cavalier. Now the UK is in the top 10 in cases, and there's been a big turnaround in the government policy. Could you give us your summary of the British, how bad the crisis is in the UK and how you evaluate the government's response thus far?
Certainly. And Geoff, you're right. Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, was criticized for being a little bit late in terms of imposing a lockdown. We're now in the second week of the lockdown. He announced it during a national address on Monday, March 23rd, and he actually got high marks for that address. And one of the phrases he used, which I think was quite interesting, is he said, "We are all now enlisted in this fight." So certainly,
it's amazing. The war and military metaphors are just all coming back.
Absolutely, reminds you a little bit of Churchill. But I think it's fascinating because he talks about, enlisting is like we're an army now going to war, as you say. And then I think that what's interesting is when you take a look at the UK, they've done a lockdown like other people have in terms of what it means in terms of people having to stay home and everyone except for non-essential workers having to stay home. But the thing that's really interesting, I think, is taking a look at what they've done from a fiscal point of view. And what the government's put in place is programs to help companies, to help employees, and also to help the self-employed. So, for instance, they have a loan, as they would call it, a loan scheme of $330 billion to make loans to companies of all sizes. The other thing they did is the relief for employees, I think, is interesting, because what they said to companies is, we don't want you to lay people off. We understand that you're going to have people who either can't work from home, or even if they're at home, they don't have work to do because of a downturn in terms of business. But instead of firing those people, what we would rather have you do is put them on furlough. And then we, the government, will go ahead and pay for up to 80% of their compensation with a maximum of £2,500 per month. And I think it's interesting they did that because what it does is it keeps intact, if you will, the workers, the employees' relationship with the company. And instead of firing someone.
This actually is a European move. I know that the other North European countries, the kind of social democracies, have done it. The fact that a conservative prime minister in the UK would follow suit is quite striking.
It is striking, but I also think it makes a lot of sense because what it means is hopefully when we can start relaxing the restrictions, when business starts to come back, it means that you still have that relationship with the employee. So you can call them up and say, come back to work, or I'm going to engage you to work from home. And you still have that infrastructure built. You still have that relationship in existence, as opposed to firing a lot of people and then having to go out and rehire.
Right, and you'd expect that big firms, it'd be easier for big firms to do that. They tend to have more cash on hand. It's easier for them to borrow. If we segue to your new world of being with FinTech startups, right? They're not cash flow positive. They tend not to have a lot of cash on hand. It's very hard to borrow. What are you seeing in the FinTech sector in the UK that obviously was going gangbusters before the crisis?
Yeah. Well, and you're right. I mean, it's challenging. And there are some of those government programs that obviously we're tapping into in terms of the loans, in terms of furloughing some of the employees so that we get that stipend, if you will, paid by the government. But the other thing we're doing is obviously we've just taken a look at our business plans and we've torn up the old ones and sort of started from scratch again.
So tell us what that looks like. I mean, this is happening in real time. How do you reinvent the business plan?
Well, it means that people are certainly working 24/7 is what it means. But in essence, we were looking at a plan where we said we had raised a certain amount of capital. These companies are still cash flow negative. And then we were looking at doing subsequent rounds of financing maybe in the fall towards the end of the year. So now we have to look at it and say, well, we can't assume that the venture capital markets are going to be open again by then. Our revenues are certainly going to be less than what we anticipated. So if we had cash that we thought was going to last for 6 months or 9 months, we now have to look at it and have that stretch out to be a 12 months, 18 months or longer in terms of making sure that the companies can survive. So we're going through the revenue projections and certainly focusing on the expenses.
So in the startup world, that means there's no recourse to, in essence, the corporate bond market, right? It's got to be direct financing.
It's direct financing, and basically what you do is you have to cut your expense base. So you have to take a look at it and say, what expenses can I cut? What do I absolutely have to have? And as I said to our management teams in a number of firms, this is not a situation where you look at it and say, gee, let's start with our expense base of $1 and let's see what we can cut. It's actually starting with a clean piece of paper and saying, what expenses do I have to incur to keep my doors open? Which is a much different mentality in terms of how you go about that. And it gives you the ability to cut your expenses by 40, 50, 60%, which is the type of thing that you need to do.
And so that's it's a hibernation strategy. You've just got to see if you can slow down the burn rate until the economy comes back.
With a couple of companies, that's exactly the word that I use. We need to go into a hibernation in terms of what we do. Now, one of the companies is in the payment field, and we actually see some opportunities coming out of this in terms of engaging with clients, et cetera. So there it's difficult in terms of how do we pursue those revenue opportunities at the same time as conserving our cash. But one of the things that it also entails, and this is a point of leadership, which is we're saying to management, we need to cut the salaries of a number of people as well. And because for a number of these companies, that is the primary expense at this point. And so cutting the salaries, and of course, senior management has got to take the lead on that. And that's also where the money is as well. So it's saying we need to have material reductions in compensation, and you need to lead the way in terms of how you're going to communicate that to the employees and how you're going to communicate that to the rest of your suppliers as well.
So let's talk a little bit then about leadership and management, but broaden it out. So now you're in the world of startups, but in the last crisis, Citi was at the core of the financial crisis. So if you look back and you think about the leadership and management lessons from there, how applicable are they today, and how do they apply to much smaller organizations than Citi was?
I think it's a great question, and I think that as I think about it, and this is one of the things we've been talking about, obviously, is there's sort of three components that I look at that the management or leadership needs to look at in terms of facing a crisis. The first thing is when you have a crisis, what type of infrastructure are you going to put around it? What are the policies? What are the practices? What are the protocols that you're going to put in place and decide who has what decision rights? That's one thing. The second thing is to make sure that the decisions you're making reflect the corporate values. We're always judged, and corporations are always judged by their actions and their words, but that is especially true during the time of a crisis. Because during the time of a crisis, your actions and your words are truly going to define what that company is all about to both your employees as well as your customers, as well as the world at large. And then the third thing is about communication. And how do you communicate? When do you communicate? What are the messages you give? So those are the three general areas that I look at in terms of how do we apply that.
And you think that basically the playbook is the same now as it was 2008-9?
I do in a lot of respects. I mean, let me take a look at the first one, which is, what's the protocol you have? What's the infrastructure you put around a crisis? And so one of the things that we did when I was at Citi, and again, we were in 55 countries around the region. So we were always having at least a handful of countries where we had some sort of crisis, military, social, economic, et cetera. So we put together a task force of people from across the organization, all the different functions, compliance, legal, HR, the different products, and then, of course, the geography that was impacted. And we get together on a daily basis. And so we're doing the same thing with the startups I'm involved with, is, having daily meetings. What are we hearing? What are we seeing? What are we hearing from the government in terms of relief? What are we hearing from our employees? What are we hearing from our customers? Making sure that we have that communication. But one of the things I think is really interesting, one of the most difficult things in a crisis is looking at policies and procedures that you had during normal times, and what are you now going to do with that during a crisis? And during a crisis, there's oftentimes a cry from people in terms of, oh, we have to change this policy. We have to change this procedure. And you have to remember that you have those policies and procedures in place, not just for normal times in terms of how do you conduct business and how do you have discipline, but during a crisis, those are especially put to test. One of the examples I'm seeing right now is banks all have a rule. They've had a rule in the past that says traders cannot trade from home. And there were a whole host of reasons why they had that rule. They want traders to be on the desk in the office so that the phone lines can be recorded, so that their positions can be monitored, so that you can have compliance around what they do. Now, all of a sudden, with many of the banks still have a handful of traders coming to the office, but most of them are at home. So what do you do about that? How do you continue to conduct business, protect your positions, trade with your clients, keep the markets open if your traders are at home and you have a policy that says they can't trade? So one of the banks that I'm familiar with has a large operation in Italy. So they had a chance to see this coming, and they said, gee, Italy's gone into lockdown. We anticipate that the UK is going to do the same thing. So what they did is they said to the traders, we're going to install a trading unit in your home. We're going to have the phone turrets there. They're going to be hardline. We're going to have the Bloomberg there. We're going to have the rest of the technology there so that you can trade from home. And we'll be able to record the lines. We'll be able to monitor what you do. We'll be able to consolidate the positions, et cetera. So there's an example where they changed the policy to say that people could trade from home. But what they looked at is they said, what was that? Why did we have that policy? Why was it in place? What were we trying to safeguard? And so we'll change the policy, but we'll keep the essence of it in terms of the way that we change our operation going forward. And that's the type of thing I think companies have to do as they're facing a crisis, is not be wedded to some policy necessarily, but think about what were they trying to achieve and how do they modify for the situation.
Yeah, so that, the balancing act between continuity and change is everywhere. Jim, this has been a fantastic conversation. I want to thank you for it, for your insights into the UK and the world of FinTech and of big finance. Jim Cowles, thanks very much for today.
Right.